All right, so today we are examining something called the mud flood theory. In a nutshell, this theory states that at some point in time, anywhere between 1,000 plus, say, years ago to like only 100 years ago, that there was a catastrophic event that affected the entire world called the mud flood. Many people, according to this theory, lost their lives, leading to a global reset or a cover up where they could hide the true history of the world. Now, please keep in mind as I explain the main theory that there are some differences between what many adherents say about the mud flood theory. So, not everybody agrees exactly with like one uniform theory, but for the sake of brevity, I'm doing the best I can to simplify this into what I consider to be the most widely accepted definition within that community. And just so I'm being honest, I come to this discussion with my own set of biases. So I welcome questions later from both sides on this topic to try to keep it fair and balanced. So the main idea is that this all started from Russian sources who claim that there is a lost civilization named Tartaria, who were a technologically advanced empire that ended up causing the mud flood. The mud flood being a worldwide catastrophic event that ended up covering the entire world in mud. On a side note, since the theory seems to have originated in Russia, I think it's interesting that there is an old phrase that says something to the effect that if you scratch a Russian, you will find a Tartar. So before we go into detail about the supposed Tartarian Empire, let's take a brief look at the origins of the word Tartaria. This word is derived from the Greek word Tartarus, which is basically synonymous with the concept of hell. The reason for this is that Europeans looked at the Mongols as invaders from hell. The Mongols were essentially a nomadic culture, so they were known to roam across wide ranges and plains. Also, as nomads, they were not known for making buildings and such, so architecture would not be something that they excelled at. So keep that in mind for the later evidence about architecture and Tartaria. The reason why I bring this up is that according to the mud flood theory, Tartaria was this advanced civilization that built these impressive buildings with gigantic doors, windows, and ceilings. But those kinds of things are not produced by a nomadic culture. The mud flood evidence for Tartaria is basically old maps. These maps show Tartaria as being basically the same place that the Mongols ruled from. This area became what we widely know as today as Central Asia. And as newer maps were created, Tartaria on these maps became smaller and smaller to accommodate for the countries, presumably, that were actually there. I've heard it said that Tartaria was just an idea that they placed on maps along with things like sea monsters and other fantastic beasts, as that was the style of the time. China became labeled as China later on in these maps, and Russia became labeled as Russia, etc. And if Tartaria was removed from the maps due to a mud flood, say, then one must wonder why the rest of the countries of the world did not disappear as well. After all, this was supposed to be a worldwide event. Why did only one place, the supposed Tartaria, change on the maps? Also, old maps were based upon books and not actual measurements. They did not make more accurate maps until the 1700s. That is why maps before the 18th century look so odd and fanciful and include mythical beasts on them. So, this would seem to suggest that any global catastrophic mud flood would need to predate 1700. But many adherents to the theory say that the American orphan trains of, like, say, the late 19th and early 20th centuries in America are the product of an effort to conduct a great reset on the population. So take these kids that have memories of what went on prior to the mud flood and then distribute them out throughout the Midwest as orphans in order to hide the history. So orphans from eastern cities were sent to rural areas of the Midwest for adoption and foster care. The theory postulates that the powers that be needed to erase history and do a global reset, so to speak, so they could change history and erase the memory of the global mud flood catastrophe from the minds of anyone who remembered it. This is called the Great Reset. And on a side note, some people believe that there has been more than one Great Reset, or that there are Great Resets that are cyclical in nature. But this does not explain how an event in North America would erase the memories of the entire world. But I digress. Another aspect of the mud flood theory has to do with architecture, like we talked about earlier. They say that many buildings have unexplained features, such as large doors, huge windows, and gigantic ceilings. The implication here is that the Tartarians, so to speak, were all giants or Nephilim or something along those lines. But I'm not sure how this would explain all of the buried buildings that they also cite as mud flood evidence, which do not have these features. I'm also unaware of any buildings in the areas on these maps labeled as Tartaria that have any buildings with big doors on them that the way they suggest. So you would think if Tartaria was the center of all this, architecture, then why don't they have any of it there? Anyway, let's move on. The mud flood proponents point to how many buildings in various places have odd features, such as small windows at ground level, that seem to suggest that half a bottom of a story was at one time covered with mud. Like, why would they cover half a layer of the bottom floor? How does that make sense? Then there have been excavations beneath various buildings that show deeper levels of a building than was previously assumed, and or whole remains of previous or partial buildings that they simply just built over the top of. Many of the buildings that the particular claims are evidence for regarding the mud flood theory are questionably explained as previous exhibits or remains of past world fairs, both of which could be considered exhibits. An example of this would be leftover buildings from, say, the 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco or the Polytechnic Museum in Russia, which they explain as an exhibit. They also claim that the White House is evidence of Tartarian architecture, or the mud flood. They say that the horse and buggy technology of the time was not advanced enough to help them build structures like, say, the White House or the Salt Lake City Temple. So, that in mind, let's talk about some important dates to remember and include the following. 1. The White House was built in 1792. 2. The World's Fair was in 1915. 3. The Salt Lake City Temple is said to have been built in the 1850s. 4. The Mongol Empire lasted from 1206 to 1368. 5. St. Petersburg was founded in 1703. 6. And the Great Sphinx of Egypt, who they also claim was covered by mud flood, was created presumably in prehistoric times. Any photographic mud flood evidence can be no later than the 1830s. So there's a wide range of dates that the mud flood theory has to bridge together in order to keep that theory viable. And remember, there have been many floods around the world since the beginning of time. But they are saying that this one global event, and they're not talking about the Diluvian flood of Noah from the Bible. In any event, some of the questions that the advocates for the mud flood theory pose include the following. How can construction with horse and buggy technology in the 1850s be able to accommodate the Salt Lake City Temple with 2 stories that were built below ground? And how are they able to, with horse and buggy technology, to build the elaborate design of the White House? If you look at the other build structures like houses and whatnot in the area, they seem quite out of date compared to like the White House, etc. Next, why would you build entryways and windows and then block them out or block them off and bury them underground? Like, why would you do that? Why did excavations digging through the dirt find bricks 15 feet underground of known structures that they didn't even know were there? Why would buildings have these tiny little windows and half cover them from bottom levels? Like, why? How does that make sense? Nevertheless, the adherents to the mud flood theory believe that Tartaria was an advanced civilization similar to Atlantis, who had limitless supplies of ethereal energy. And they believed that their advanced technology was somehow responsible for causing a whole worldwide flood. But I'm not sure how they reconcile this, knowing that the only peoples who occupied the supposed land of quote unquote Tartaria were a horseback people known as the Mongols. But the Mongols, who rode horses, had similar technologies to the horse and buggy culture of the people who they say cannot have built things like the White House, etc. So there's an inconsistency. And the other aspect that gets left unaddressed is that the same proof for Tartaria that they cite in the ancient maps does not show the borders of Tartaria extending to North America, where they supposedly built the White House and the structures of the 1915 World's Fair. So if you're using the map of Tartaria, or maps, plural, of Tartaria as evidence, then why doesn't that said evidence also cover other things which you attribute to Tartaria? They also suggest that the great fires of the 20th century, like the one that started in Chicago, were started to destroy the evidence for Tartarian architecture because they say they were trying to cover up and do the Great Reset and hide the true history from us. So there's that. As previously stated, sometimes they say Tartaria was a place of advanced technology, and we are re-engineering what they left behind. So, like, if a site is affected by a mud flood, this event would have to be so big that it killed off the majority of the world's population, so they had to have a reset. Yet the buildings in photos are perfectly preserved. They so they look almost new. Yet they did not cover all the mud. They let some remain and just cover up the foundation, and they just covered what remained in asphalt and concrete. In the 18th century, they would build down. They would dig down and move the dirt forward and push it onto the street. A concrete staircase would be added to give the building more class by having to walk upstairs to get into the building, and the extra dirt became part of the raised street. So there are some explanations for why buildings were built that way. Now let's talk about the photographic evidence briefly. Many people wonder why there are no people in old photographs and cite that as evidence of the mud flood. So if you're looking at a bunch of old photographs, they're like, hey, there's no people in those. Look at the city, there's no people there. They must have all been killed off by the mud flood, etc. But let's take a look at that. Any photograph used to show the mud flood can be no older than the 1830s. The exposure time back then was so long that moving people in the city in the shot would not show up in the photograph. A minute-long exposure was required for those photographs. So you wouldn't see people in there because if they're moving, they wouldn't show up. Photography was not available to the mass public till around 1900. Before that, there were only drawings and such. There are many records of flooding in the 1800s, all the way to the present, but none of these were global events, and they were all over the United States as only regional events among everywhere else in the world. So they were all only regional events. But the mud flood was supposed to be a single global event. So you cannot use photographs of regional floods from different times and places as evidence of the mud flood. So there you have it. That's a brief rundown of the mud flood and the theory we're going to be talking today and examining and getting different perspectives on.